like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Jabagai and Yirraganji people here in Cairns in Queensland, Australia. My presentation will be slightly different from the one of the previous guys. So if there's any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here in the audience, just be warned that it can cause distress. So violence, brutality, torture, cruelty, and death, tragically for individuals of minority groups, they're more than just words, they're lived experience, which is often exercised by governments of social control. For others, these words elicit distinct discomfort in today's moral economy, where the mass public gloss over state violence so that they can pretend that they didn't know. This remains the status quo in Australia. Okay, why is it not moving? There we go. In today's presentation, I'll argue that since the outset of settler colonial invasion, Australia was in a state of siege, with Indigenous Australians becoming the internal enemy. Using the theory of necropolitics, I argue that the state of siege continues in temporary Australia through the oppression of Indigenous Australians, through forms of violence that not only target Indigenous Australians, but that are systemic in nature, hidden or embedded in policies and practices of the criminal justice system. I also highlight how the economic strife that many Indigenous Australians face exacerbates this already volatile situation. Settler colonialism was based on displacing Indigenous populations from the land so that the settlers could work the land. Therefore, the settlement of Australia involved the attempted elimination of the Indigenous Australian people. This aligns with Achilles Mbembe, who said that the ultimate expression of sovereignty stems from the power and the capacity to decide who matters and who does not, who is disposable and who's not. The British, by exercising their sovereignty through control over mortality, gained total dominance of the invaded territory that they called Australia. What followed this invasion is what Mbembe refers to as a state of siege that allows a modality of killing that doesn't distinguish between external and internal enemy, and as a result, whole populations become a target. There, from the beginning of settler colonial control, Australia was in a state of siege, with Indigenous Australians viewed as the enemy within, as demonstrated by the open warfare of the early contact period. The number of massacres of Aboriginal people on the Australian mainland is well documented and can be seen in the map in this slide. The last recorded massacre of Indigenous Australians was in 1928 in Coniston, Northern Territory, where around 70 Walpurgis people were murdered by a posse of police officers. Those accused of these murders were cleared of any wrongdoing, and the Aboriginal people who survived were refused any legal representation. Therefore, it appears that in the 19th and 20th century, the law would be suspended when it came to the use of arbitrary power and equity before the law in relation to Aboriginal people. So during the early stages of the state of siege, it became apparent that the Indigenous Australian people were not going to be as easy to eliminate as the settler colonials believed, and the resistance to the colonisation continued. The settler colonials therefore decided to change the tactics and apply institutionalised forms of violence against their internal enemy through the implementation of a colonial form of criminal justice. This change now saw Indigenous Australians criminalised by implying that they were part of the dangerous classes, which included prostitutes, thieves, murderers, drinkers, beggars, vagrants, and any other person whose only common feature was to be viewed as an enemy of the state. And as such, Indigenous Australians could now be subjected to surveillance, control, repression by the police, the instruments of the state's social control. So strategies to control this enemy within into the late 19th and early 20th centuries turned toward protection and assimilation policies and practices. This included laws that controlled the daily lives of Indigenous Australians, with criminal penalties associated for breaching them. Into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, there were ongoing attempts to civilise Indigenous Australians as part of the assimilation policies, and where resistance arose to those attempts, harsh penalties were handed out. Therefore, criminalisation and punishment of Indigenous Australians was viewed as vital to the ongoing success of settler colonialism and the state of siege. Now, I argue that the statistics of Indigenous incarceration in contemporary Australia demonstrate that Australia is still in a state of siege, and Indigenous Australians continue to be represented as the enemy within. From 2008 to 2020, Indigenous Australians constituted 2.9% of the total Australian population, and per state, it varied from 1% to 30% of the total state population. And it's important to keep this in mind when looking at police interaction with alleged offenders. For all states where the data was available, except for the Northern Territory, non-Indigenous Australians appear to have a higher interaction with the police than Indigenous Australians. But when population sizes are considered, a different pattern emerges, with all the states and territories showing a higher interaction rate with Indigenous Australians in comparison to the population size as shown on the graph. The same consideration should also be made when looking at incarceration statistics. In the June quarter of 2021, Indigenous Australians accounted for 30% of the national prison population. Furthermore, the national average imprisonment rate for Indigenous Australians was 2,412 persons per 100,000 Indigenous Australian adults. Now that's compared to only 214 persons per 100,000 non-Indigenous adults. So taken at face value, without the consideration of intergenerational impact of colonisation, these figures may not cause alarm. But when you consider the 616 custodial deaths of Indigenous Australians, not from natural causes, I might add, between 1980 to 2021, a different trend begins to emerge. Effectively, the criminal justice system has become a mechanism by which Indigenous Australians can be controlled while appearing to be a neutral mechanism. So the theory of necropolitics was used in my research because it's based on the logic of destruction, particularly through mass genocide, or by confining whole populations to conditions in which they face inescapable violence and live in a constant fear of death. So not unlike being the internal enemy within a state of siege. The findings of my research suggest that as the internal enemy, Indigenous Australians are being necropolitically targeted, zombified, and transmogrified into Homo sacer. And it also unveiled how the unequal relations of power between the Indigenous Australian population and the criminal justice system that exist in this state of siege leads to a sense of deific authority, which leads to some criminal justice officers to be more prone to inflicting violence on Indigenous Australians. So necropolitical targeting is where criminal justice officers are deciding that the lives of Indigenous Australians do not matter, and they're not valued by society, and they are therefore disposable. It's achieved through the use of necropower, where the lives of Indigenous Australians are subjugated to the power of social, political, cultural, and even physical death by the system. This imposes a death-like status on Indigenous Australians so that they are zombified by the criminal justice system. Zombification is a political cultural process whereby groups of people, usually minority or marginalised groups, are conferred the status of the living dead. This means that the criminal justice system perceives these groups as less than human, denies them of possessing any human qualities, personality or dignity, and divests them of their individuality. The combination of necropolitical targeting, zombification, effectively transmogrifies Indigenous Australians to become Homo sacer. Now, Homo sacer is a citizen who's bound by the state's laws, but he has no rights, and he can be killed, but not murdered, and who exemplifies the state's power, but he is powerless himself. In the state of siege, as the internal enemy, Indigenous Australians are denied certain unalienable rights, and due to the unequal relations of power, they are without the power, influence, or capacity to stop this unfair treatment at the hands of the system. So deific authority, some might argue that necropolitical targeting and zombification emerge as a response to what Van Manen refers to as the perpetual struggle with those who would disobey, disrupt, do harm, agitate, or otherwise upset the just order. This view may be particularly held by those criminal justice system employees who qualify or empower themselves as more capable of discerning who is respectable and who's not, as well as better sensing right from wrong. In other words, members of the criminal justice system attempt to impose their status as legitimate holders and wielders of authority in a manner that emphasizes their alleged superiority. This
Kirstie,
is also
5 minutes.
Okay.
5
This
minutes.
is also upheld by the state of exception that exists within the criminal justice system. Now, this is viewed as a necropolitical strategy, which appears to operate inside of the law, but in reality functions outside of the law by temporarily suspending it. Now, that refers to the law allowing guilty party to walk free, which in my research refers to the lack of accountability for officers of the law that break the law in respect to their treatment of Indigenous Australians. Now, this state of exception, this perceived untouchable status, becomes a fertile breeding ground for some officers of the law to develop what I call a sense of deific authority. Now, I created this concept because it encapsulates my views that some officers of the law believe that their positions within the criminal justice system give them a legitimate superiority over ordinary people, specifically Indigenous Australians, that gives them an almost godlike ultimate authority. And as a consequence, it makes them more prone to inflicting violence on Indigenous Australians. I might just skip, I might have a bit of time for this one. So my research found that there were 3 prevalent forms of violence, and that was systemic, symbolic, and subjective. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on all 3, but systemic violence was the one that was found across all branches of the criminal justice system. Now, it's important to note the subtle move from the early outright subjective violence of the frontier wars to these more covert forms of violence. Systemic violence, by its nature, is a kind of invisible violence because it stems from legitimate powers, discretions, and responsibilities being exercised in a way that, although not are legal, they nevertheless reproduce an inequality, immobility, and injustice, and most importantly, misery for particular demographic groups in the community. In my case, it was Indigenous Australians. Now, the extent that it was experienced by the participants in my research was through powers that included the power to arrest, the power to find guilty rather than to acquit or withdraw, the power to incarcerate, and the power to breach parole. So the mothers, fathers, uncles, aunties, brothers, sisters, sons, or daughters that are captured in the statistics that I've mentioned, who are portrayed as this internal enemy of contemporary Australia, are the descendants of those Indigenous Australians who were persecuted as the enemy within during the frontier wars and the centuries in between. The colonial dossier of invasion, genocide, displacement, paternalistic governments, and disempowerment has left a sociogenic legacy of international marginalisation, alienation, and disparity, resulting in a life of inequality for Indigenous Australian peoples. This marginalisation and dependency is driven by the systemic frustrations of aspirations, whereby the dominant social order obstructs access to the political, social, and economic structure. This leads to many Indigenous Australians experiencing poverty, low educational attainment, family violence, family breakdown, suicide, and family involvement in crime at higher rates than non-Indigenous Australians. The experiences of my participants recounted in my thesis, as well as previous literature on social determinants of crime, they demonstrate that adverse childhood events, especially poverty, strongly contribute to the potential for a child to come into contact with the criminal justice system, particularly the police.
Less than 1 minute.
Okay. I believe that the evidence I presented in this presentation supports my argument that Australia is still in a state of siege, where Indigenous Australians are still seen as the internal enemy, and they continue to be oppressed through forms of violence that not only target Indigenous Australians, but that are systemic in nature, hidden or embedded in those policies and practices of the criminal justice system. Furthermore, I feel that I've presented evidence that supports my theory that the economic strife faced by Indigenous Australians exacerbates this volatile situation, or maybe not quite in as much depth as I would like to have gone into. As a result, the Australian state of siege cannot be referred to as a past event, a historical era, or with an "oh, that was 200 years ago" attitude. The state of siege exists in today's inequalities that situate Indigenous Australians as the enemy within. Thanks very much for your time. Oh. I just skip out a few bits in between there, sorry.